Welcome. Qaaman's timeline explanation is not only one of the most widely viewed on the internet, but since it was also one of the first, most of the other theories I've seen borrow from it in one way or another. That's why I thought it made sense to respond to his video. By doing so, I'll also be addressing many other channels that took inspiration from his take. Now, since this is a highly complex topic, I'll focus this video on the parts of Qaaman's explanation that don't hold up. I'll go over why they don't work, highlight the mistakes, and offer a brief look at what could have really happened. That being said, the goal of this video is not to provide a full breakdown of Dragon Ball's time paradox. For that, you can check out the video linked in the description, Cell's Saga Time Paradox Ultimate Analysis, as well as the other videos where I dive deeper into specific aspects of it. So, with that out of the way, let's start with Qaaman's rules for time travel in Dragon Ball.
So, let's begin with rule number 1. Rule number 1 is that when a time traveler travels back to the past, he creates an alternate timeline that diverges off to that certain point. So for example, without even using Dragon Ball Z in the equation, if I go back to the past, I am creating a new timeline, and that is a new timeline because that lifestyle that I created is going to differ from the one that I originally came from, and the outcomes are going to be very different in terms of how the people live their lives. So that's rule number 1, and I'm sure many of you guys have learned this before from other types of timeline genres and such. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2. Once a time traveler has created a link between two alternate timelines, he can move back and forth between those timelines without exactly creating a new branch. And there's proof of this in Dragon Ball Z. In Dragon Ball Z, when Trunks went back to the past and killed Frieza and King Cole, he is creating a new timeline. And he's able to go back and forth between his timeline and our timeline without necessarily creating a new branch, and it's proven as the Z fighters recognize Trunks. If Trunks was going to a completely different timeline, then the Z warriors would not have known who he was from the future. So that's rule number 2. Rule number 3, last but most importantly, once a time traveler travels further back in time, this creates a new timeline, since this would change the events that would take place in the future from an earlier standpoint. So you guys will see later on in this video today that there is an instance where a time traveler traveled back further than another time traveler, and that itself created a new timeline, since that will make the events that follow afterwards differ from the original outcome. So I hope you guys understand these 3 important rules, and let's get straight into the explanation.
The rules he identifies are mostly correct, but there's one key rule he overlooks, and it's crucial to understanding how the paradox works. This rule states, when traveling to the past creates a new universe, the resulting universe will take the timeline where the travel was headed to as its foundation, regardless of the traveler's original timeline. In other words, if someone from Timeline 1 travels to the past of Timeline 2 and creates Timeline 3, then Timeline 3 will be a copy of Timeline 2, not Timeline 1st. Now let's dive into his breakdown of the different timelines. I'll skip straight to the parts I believe are incorrect. If you want the full context, I'll leave a link to his original video in the description.
In order for Trunks to have had a timeline that he was originally planning to return to, as you know when Cell explains that Trunks was trying to go back and tell the Z fighters that he had defeated the androids later on, as you will see.
That might seem like a small detail, but it's actually a key one. Cell has no idea why Trunks wanted to travel to the past. It's Piccolo who comes to that conclusion on his own. But here's the thing. Piccolo could be wrong.
Now, in age 764, in the unseen timeline, Trunks presumably kills Frieza and King Cole and gives Goku the heart virus medicine similar to the Trunks that we see in the main timeline that we will get to later on in this video. Then Trunks tells Goku about the upcoming android threat, gives Goku the heart virus medicine, and then returns back to his timeline in age 784.
The issue I have with Qaaman's interpretation of the unseen timeline is that if events unfolded too similarly to what we see, Trunks wouldn't have changed his actions, and if he didn't, it would create a plot hole. The Trunks from the unseen timeline must have acted differently from the one in the third timeline, or fourth, according to Qaaman, and that difference has to be justified by something Cell did before Trunks arrived. To make things more complicated, Qaaman's explanation includes yet another timeline between the manga version and the unseen one. In other words, his unseen timeline should actually differ even more from the manga one than mine does. Because in my version, the manga timeline is a direct copy of the unseen one.
Later on, Trunks returns to the unseen timeline from age 785 and arrives in age 767 to assist the Z-Fighters from the predicted android threat. Now, we do not know much more about this timeline, but one thing is certain. Trunks somehow found a means to defeat the androids when he returned back to his time in age 785, which means he most likely got blueprints or some other device from Dr. Gero's laboratory, similar to how we saw Trunks go to Dr. Gero's lab in the main timeline that we know. So Trunks gets the blueprints in age 767 in the unseen timeline, and then returns back to age 785 in the original timeline, and then defeats the androids in age 785.
Here's another mistake, probably taken from the official guides. The problem with Trunks finding the androids' blueprints in the unseen timeline, or Timeline 2 in my version, is that in the manga timeline, Timeline 3 in my version, Timeline 4 in Qaaman's, Trunks only finds Gero's hidden lab after Cell reveals its existence to Piccolo. That means Trunks finding the blueprints is a change introduced by Cell in Timeline 3, so it couldn't have happened in Timeline 2 because Cell wasn't around to share that information. In that version of events, Gero's secret lab remained hidden. To be fair, Qaaman does allow for other interpretations, but he still insists Trunks finds the lab just like he did in the manga following timeline, even though Cell wasn't there. That's the first major hole in his theory. In truth, the manga hints that Trunks defeated the androids in the original timeline thanks to the Senzu beans he brought back from his first trip to the past, the one where he helped Goku against King Cold.
Years later, in age 788, Trunks is planning on returning back to the past to tell the Z-Fighters that he had defeated both androids 17 and 18 in his timeline. But here is where another timeline is created. Cell kills Trunks right before Trunks takes a trip back into the time machine, and then Cell takes a trip back to age 763, which is a year before age 764, and as I had explained in the rules of Dragon Ball Z time travel that we created, going back in time further would create a new timeline, as differed from the one that Trunks had originally created himself, which creates the history of Trunks timeline, as we will call it, or you can call it the hot timeline.
The second major flaw, in my opinion, is how Qaaman explains the good timeline for future Trunks. In that timeline, Trunks never mentions Cell. But if Cell had arrived there at the same time as in the main timeline, someone would have noticed him, at the very least. Qaaman claims this creates several plot holes, and on that point, I agree. But the issue isn't with Dragon Ball. It's with his theory. Since he got the structure wrong, a lot of his explanation falls apart under scrutiny. Let's take a closer look at the plot holes he mentions and see why they aren't really plot holes at all.
So guys, now that I've explained to you guys my Dragon Ball Z alternate timeline theory, I will now explain to you guys the plot holes that were created throughout the Dragon Ball Z timeline theory and things that simply just don't make sense. So I'm going to first show you this small little clip, and then I'll explain to you afterwards how this is indeed a plot hole.
Now I understand. You learned the Kamehameha wave when you inherited Goku's cells.
That's right.
When I get my hands on...
Goku's were not the last cells I would inherit, however. In a most fortunate turn of events, Frieza paid a brief visit to Earth, and although it seemed that he was mostly machine at the time, it was possible to extract a few of his remaining cells before he finally met his end at the hands of Trunks.
Dirty little Saiyan!
Trunks cells would have been collected, but Dr. Gerone's computer had determined that there was already a sufficient collection of Saiyan powers within my makeup.
So tell me this.
Now, after watching the clip, you're probably wondering, where does this plot hole take place? Well, according to our timeline theory, the cell that was talking to Piccolo in Timeline 4, also known as the main timeline, was from Timeline 1, the original timeline. Because of this, he came from the original timeline where there were no time travelers that altered the initial events of that time. Because of this, Goku must have been the one who had killed Frieza and King Cole in Cell's time. With that said, there was no possible way that the spy robots were even aware of Trunks' presence, as he wasn't even born yet and he couldn't have possibly have come from the future. Because of this, it's wrong for Cell to have said that the spy robots barely had enough time to extract Frieza and King Cole's DNA before they met their end by the hands of Trunks, when Trunks wasn't even there or couldn't have possibly have been there.
This one comes from a misreading of the manga. Cell only says they could have collected Trunks' cells, but they ultimately discarded them. He never says Trunks defeated Mecha Frieza and King Cold. Toriyama reused a panel in the manga to save time, and the anime made it more confusing by replaying the whole fight. But as Qaaman himself confirms, it was Goku who killed them. The important thing is, Cell's development took decades, and the spy robot kept gathering cells over time. Since Gohan trained Trunks from a young age, it's obvious that the robot had many chances to gather his cells, even without that particular fight. At no point does Cell say Trunks' cells came from that moment specifically. So this isn't a plot hole.
I will show you guys a small clip, and afterwards I will come back to explain how this is indeed another bigger plot hole.
But why did you choose this particular time?
I didn't. The coordinates were preset by Trunks. I merely pushed a button and the machine went where it was programmed to go.
Now it's starting to become clear. Trunks had set the coordinates to the present in order to tell us that he had destroyed the androids in the future. But instead, this creep hijacked it.
Now, we know from my timeline explanation that as Trunks is preparing to go back from age 788 to age 763, from the original timeline to the unseen timeline, he is killed by Cell. Then Cell proceeded to take his time machine and he returned to age 763, therefore creating a new timeline. Now, keep in mind that age 763 is a year before Frieza and King Cole attacked planet Earth. Initially, Trunks was planning to return to age 763 to tell the Z Fighters that he had defeated the androids, similar to how Trunks from the History of Trunks' timeline could have gone back to tell the Z Fighters, he beat Cell and the androids in what could have been the movie BoJack Unbound. But chronologically, this is a plot hole because it doesn't make sense why Trunks would take a trip back to age 763 a year before Frieza and King Cold had even decided to attack Earth. Cell said that the time machine was programmed to go back to age 763, but during that year, the Z Fighters wouldn't have ever heard of Trunks, the android threat, and were unaware that Frieza would even attack the following year. Especially in regards to our timeline rules, it states that if a traveler goes back further in time, they create a new timeline, as it changes future events from an earlier standpoint. This causes two major inconsistencies on its own. But there are two fan theories that try to explain how this may have fit in to the Dragon Ball Z logical world. Now, plot hole explanation number 1 states that the reason why Trunks went back in time to age 763 was to create a timeline where he killed Dr. Gero and the androids before Goku even had to get back to Earth. That way he could have essentially made an even better outcome where he just solved all the problems himself now that he has knowledge of where Dr. Gero's lab actually was. So I can kind of see where that one would make sense. This would actually make a lot of sense in regards to why Trunks would have gone back in time to age 763 to create an even better outcome, and the only real difference that we would have to take into account is that Piccolo would have been wrong in evaluating why Trunks had gone back in time. It wouldn't have been to tell the Z Fighters that he had defeated the androids, it would have been to actually kill Dr. Gero on his own and create an even better timeline. But that's a little bit too much of an analysis, and that isn't exactly true in terms of the Dragon Ball Z world, but it does kind of make up for this plot hole. It would just mean that Trunks essentially created two different timelines, and he should have just made the unseen timeline even better instead of creating a brand new one. But that's besides the point. One thing to take in mind when dealing with this plot hole is that it would make more sense for Trunks to return to age 767 instead of him returning to age 763. Similar to how Trunks from the Hot timeline could have returned to age 767 during the BoJack arc.
Here, Qaaman relies on Piccolo's assumption instead of the more solid explanation we actually get from Trunks. At one point, Trunks considers going further back in time to destroy Gero's lab before the androids are activated. He drops the idea only because, in the timeline that follows the manga, things turn out well. That means in the unseen timeline, things must have gone worse, which justifies his decision to try again. If Cell had said this was Trunks' plan, it would be a plot hole, because Cell was secretly watching Trunks. But since Trunks himself gives us this better reason, it's the one we should go with. If his goal was to destroy the lab before the androids ever awaken, then traveling 1 year earlier makes total sense. Qaaman says this doesn't align with Dragon Ball logic, but I don't really get what he means by that. What is this Dragon Ball logic that creates confusion instead of solving it? If the manga leaves the door open to both versions, shouldn't we go with the one that actually works? Qaaman insists. Trunks should have made a better timeline from the start, but that's not how it works. To destroy the lab, he had to find it first. And even during his second trip to the past, he still didn't know where it was. So if in the unseen timeline Trunks did manage to find the lab, like he eventually does in the manga timeline, it makes perfect sense that he first had to create the unseen one, then later create the ideal timeline once he had the info.
Now, we are on the last but not least most important plot hole of the day. This plot hole started when I was explaining earlier in the Dragon Ball Z alternate timeline theory about when Cell traveled back in time and went to the Hot timeline. Where exactly did he go? Well, that in itself is a plot hole because Cell theoretically should have existed in the history of Trunks' timeline in order for this to make sense, because in reality, when Trunks went back in time from age 784 to age 764 from the hot timeline to the main timeline, that splits off the fact that Cell would be in two timelines. So Cell is in our timeline, but in reality, he should have been in the hot timeline. Well, here are some fan theories as to
This final plot hole just comes from misunderstanding how the timelines work. The Ho-Ti timeline in Qaaman's video is actually Timeline 4. It was created when Cell's time travel interfered with Trunks' journey, leading to a new version of Trunks who could never return to his original timeline. Timeline 4 is a copy of the original, made when Trunks tried to go back to his own timeline from the one that follows the manga. So it stays identical up to the point where Trunks returns from his first trip. In that version, the only Cell that exists is the one who eventually gets defeated. In short, in the Ho-Ti timeline, there is no Cell from the future. So all of these supposed plot holes are really just misreadings of the story. And again, this video isn't meant to attack Qaaman. I've genuinely searched the internet for a coherent explanation of the Cell Saga's time paradox, and I haven't found one. I chose to respond to his video because, as I said earlier, it's a good starting point for clearing up these misconceptions. Figuring out the true logic behind Dragon Ball's time paradox is something I'm proud of, because as far as I know, I'm the first Dragon Ball creator to really crack Toriyama's puzzle. The Cell Saga was written like a mystery, and a good mystery has to be consistent, but also hard to solve. That's exactly what Master Toriyama pulled off. The Cell Saga was the arc he worked hardest on, and in my view, it represents his peak as a storyteller. That's why it bothers me when it's called one of the worst written arcs. I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't miss the next ones. Thanks for watching.